Hello, New Hope, and welcome to our new series called Mind and Soul, We Are Not Consumed. I'm sure you've been to the fair or you've been to an arcade and you've either seen or you've played the game Whack-A-Mole, right? And the moles come out of the ground and you're whacking them, and at first you're like, hey, I got this, no problem. But then all of a sudden, one mole after another keeps coming up, and you're like whacking like crazy all over the place, and eventually you lose the game because you cannot whack all the moles that come up, and they win, right? You know, moles are pests that dig holes and tunnels through your yard, and they destroy your trees, or they eat the roots of your plants. And I think the game Whack-A-Mole is sort of a picture of this last year and what we've experienced. That we've had all these moles popping up in our life, and we're trying to whack them, we're trying to keep them under control, and in reality, we haven't been able to do it. I mean, in my life, I haven't been able to do it either. And because of this experience, we have all dealt with a shift in our mental health. And it's because we can't keep up with the moles. That's reality. Because of this, whether we realize it or not, we've all gone through a shift in the level of our mental health. You know, for some of us, we think, well, I don't struggle with mental health. Well, we all struggle at times with mental health because we all have mental health, a level of it, right? We have what? Good days and we have bad days. So if our mental health was, say, on the spectrum of this 25-foot tape measure, over this last year, I guarantee because of the scenarios or the moles that we've all experienced, our mental health has shifted, has moved on the spectrum somewhere. It's just the reality of it, right? So psychologists say today that the biggest challenge that we've all experienced and are experiencing over this last year is grieving. Now, when we think of grieving, we often relate it to when someone dies in our life, right? And we grieve emotionally and intellectually of, you know, why did that need to happen? And we walk through the grieving process of denial and anger and bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. But it takes a long time to walk through that grieving process, and it's difficult. We relate this grieving process typically to death. Yet today, because of what's taken place over this last year, we've all experienced some level of grieving. Why? Well, because of so many changes, so many moles that have popped their head out of the ground into our life, right? I mean, we've all experienced the loss of normalcy. You know, our work situation, our school situation for our kids. You know, our daily routines or our weekends, like, hey, I'm going to take off for the weekend, vacations, whatever. So much has changed, right? The whole idea of fear of illness, of getting sick, getting COVID, the fear of the economic toll and the changes that it has made in our economy or maybe personally in our work situation. You know, we've had the loss of connectedness, which has been a big one. The idea of aloneness today and people feeling alone is incredible. And so we've heard people talk about how they haven't been able to see their kids or their grandkids, or they haven't been able to be out bowling like they used to with the bowling team, or doing what they usually did with their neighbors. And so just that loss is a level of grieving. It's reality. And just the idea of being in one place for a long time, like our homes, and being closed in and around the same people, there's a grieving and loss to that of not being able to just be free and to come and go when we want, to walk into a store and not have a mask on or social distance or whatever. All those are different levels of grieving that maybe we don't realize it, but has impacted our mental health, both our mind and our soul. So grief, they say today, is collective. There's hasn't been a time in recent history, at least as a country, except maybe back to 9/11, where we've grieved collectively as communities, as counties, and as a country as well. And because of this, we need to pay attention to our mental health, which has to do with our mind and our soul. And that's why we're going to be in this new series in April called Mind and Soul. We are not consumed. Now, when we talk about our mind, we're talking about obviously our intellect or our ability to reason about what is going on. We ask the question, how can this be? How does this work? Why is this happening, right? When we talk about our mental health and our soul, we're talking about the seat of our affection or our emotions. The Greek word actually for soul is breath, which is where we get life, right? Our intellect is great. To have our intellect is great. But what would life be like if we didn't have our soul side of us? There'd be no emotion. There'd be no laughter, right? There'd be no crying. There'd be no smiling going on. We need both. We need the intellect, but boy, we certainly need the emotion as well. God has created us to have both mind and soul and to engage in the events in our life with both of those. And we've certainly experienced that over this last year, if we're all honest. So to help us walk through this series, Mind and Soul, we're going to be going through the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament. Now, the author of Lamentations is suspected to be Jeremiah, who had the nickname the Weeping Prophet. And Jeremiah is writing in Lamentations, and he's wrestling both with his intellect, his mind, and his emotions, his soul, because of what has taken place to the nation of Israel. Lamentations, the book, expresses the nation of Israel's overwhelming sense of loss that they accompany by the Babylonians coming in and destroying Jerusalem and destroying literally their temple where they worshiped God. They saw incredible change, incredible destruction. And very similar to what we experienced over this last year, where we saw incredible change and at certain levels, destruction when it came to how people treated one another and even the impact of COVID that it had on our economy and on our health and on our relationships. We read in Lamentations as Jeremiah writes, and he expresses very clearly the horrors that the people experienced. The wholesale devastation and slaughter of kings, of princes, of the elders of the land, of commoners. Just like COVID, right? COVID was no friend to a particular race or socioeconomic level or to an age or to people that lived in a certain location. COVID impacted pretty much everybody across the board. And we read in Lamentations that the whole nation of Israel was impacted by the Babylonian invasion. So much so to where women, mothers, came to the point of cannibalism, where they had to decide whether they were going to live or die, whether they were going to eat their child or not, because the Babylonians had surrounded the city and had kept food or water from coming in. Jeremiah writes of the incredible loss of having to give up their land that God promised them years ago being taken as slaves to Babylonia and serving under the people there, of having the temple destroyed, and now having no ceremonies, no times of worship at all as a people. We get a picture of this and what has taken place in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 1, where Jeremiah writes, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She was a queen among the provinces, has now become a slave." You just see the devastation, the change right there. Again, it gives a picture of what we experienced this last year. We get this feeling more in Psalm 137, verse 1, as the Israelites are now in Babylon and they're remembering their days in Jerusalem. It says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Jerusalem." Haven't we all wept at some point over this last year as we remembered how it was pre-COVID? As we had memories of being with family or loved ones who potentially are no longer here, or being in a work situation or a home situation, or a position where financially we were secure, where now we're challenged. And this is what the nation of Israel is experiencing and what Jeremiah is writing here. And so there's this shift that the nation of Israel has experienced. One day it was a day of laughter and security and optimism. And the next day it was weeping, grieving, and doubt. It reminded me of the day my mother-in-law came to live with us years ago. The previous day, she was out with my father-in-law, out to a nice dinner on the town. They came home getting ready for bed, and my father-in-law tragically had a heart aneurysm and died. And the next day, my mother-in-law moved in with us, and from that day on, she lived with us until she got established here in Cambridge, but she never went back again to the home that they built in Hudson so that they could be closer to us. What a day and a difference a day can make, right? So we see this in verse 1 in Jeremiah's wrestling with his mind and his intellect, that it's challenged because he starts out this whole book with, "How, God? How? How in the world could this happen?" And he's questioning God. It's very similar to the book of Job, where Job is questioning God. He's a man who is puzzled with why God is allowing evil and suffering. And we see this in Jeremiah's writing as well. You see, the book of Lamentations could actually be called two different titles. The first title, Lamentations, which means sorrow, which deals with the emotional side of what Jeremiah is experiencing because of what happened to the nation of Israel. But the other title could be the word how, because of the intellectual side of what Jeremiah is wrestling with when it comes to the devastation of the nation of Israel. You see, this experience of Jerusalem being overtaken has challenged Jeremiah's mental health, right? His mind is challenged, how God, but his soul is challenged, the emotions and the pain of it as well. It's very similar to what we have experienced over this last year. So when it comes to our mental health, and when it comes to making sure we're healthy in that area, our struggle is with trying to keep our mind and our soul within balance, right? And keep it healthy. But there are times where we're challenged with this. where we approach things just intellectually and we don't approach them emotionally, or we just approach things emotionally and we don't think at all intellectually about the situation. And I know within marriages, probably, maybe some of you spouses are elbowing each other because maybe one of you come at something or an event that's been difficult and you just think about it intellectually and you don't get emotional, where others are like, well, you're just all emotion and you got to put some intellect to it. And we wrestle with that. But when it comes to our mental health, the goal and the idea here is to try to have a healthy balance between how we approach it intellectually and how we approach it emotionally, our mind and our soul. And so we see in the writings of Jeremiah and Lamentations that he's both approaching what's happened to the nation of Israel intellectually and emotionally. But he does this and he maintains hope in his situation, and he maintains hope for the nation of Israel because he's wrestling intellectually and emotionally with God. With God. That is the difference. You see, marriages that maintain and last is a marriage with a couple that wrestle through their challenges together. They don't go off and wrestle in other places, whether it's an addiction or another relationship or just being silent or separating or whatever. They maintain together and they wrestle through it. And that's what Jeremiah does in his writing in Lamentations, is that he's wrestling through what's happened to the nation of Israel with God, both intellectually and emotionally. And this is what I want to challenge us to when it comes to our mental health as a whole as we walk through this series. That we maintain and continue to wrestle with God with what has gone on over this last year and what is still going on now. And that we don't go off and wrestle other places and take our intellect and emotions there. But we maintain and we wrestle it with God. Because here's a great phrase that I love from Pastor Chuck Swindoll. He says this: anything under God's control is never out of control. Anything under God's control is never out of control. Okay? And when that is the case, regardless of our wrestling intellectually or emotionally with events that have taken place in our life, if we are wrestling with God with them, then we will not be consumed. It will not overtake us. When the word consumed, I think of a fire and how it consumes something fully, and you just have this little heap of ash. And when we talk about not being consumed, the way we're not consumed with our situation or the events over this last year is that we are wrestling with it, with our God, and wrestling with our intellect and our emotions and maintaining a healthy mental health because of that. And so anything under God's control is never out of control. And so your assignment moving forward this next week is to maintain your mental health by bringing everything under God's control and continuing to give it over to Him and wrestle with Him. Whether it has to do with your mind, intellect, or your soul, emotion. I want to end with 1 Peter 5, 6, and 7. It says this: so humble yourselves. Go to God, wrestle with Him. Humble yourselves under the mighty power of God. And at the right time, He will lift you up in honor. He will care for your intellectual questions. He'll care for your emotions, right? Give all your worries and your cares to God, for He cares about you. This is what Jeremiah is doing in the book of Lamentations. He's bringing it all and wrestling with God. And I'm inviting you to bring everything that's going on in your life and wrestle with God. And in that, bring your intellect and your emotions. And by that, maintain a healthy level of overall mental health. That is my hope for you. That is my hope for me as well. Let me pray for you. Father God, we thank you that you understand us. You knit us together in our mother's womb. You know that we have a mind and we're going to question. And you're okay with it. You know that we have a soul and we're going to get emotional and blubbery. And we're going to get sad and depressed. But you can handle that. And you invite us to bring it all to you. And in that, maintain secure and have a level of peace and have a healthy mental health. And so I pray that over each one today in your holy name. Amen. Have a good day, New Hope. Thanks for being with us.